Following this, we will have activists from the portion of this will go on the Freiburg Basic Income Centre's website for folks to consult subsequently. I will now hand over the floor to you, Kelle, and you, Neil, I believe. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Neil. And it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting us. I'm just going to share our presentation. And also apologize to those who may have heard some of this before. We see some familiar faces here. Okay, I hope you can see my presentation there, full screen mode. Not yet?
It's coming. It looks like it's on its way. There we go.
Okay, but not full screen.
No, not yet.
Oh, no.
Not
the computer screen, not this slide screen.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. So just to say that Kelle and I have divided up our presentation, and General Moyo will comment after we have taken you through our input. And what we're going to do is I'm going to speak about the political context to the struggle for basic income in South Africa, the background and the political dynamics. And Kelly's going to talk about the transition to basic income that we are trying to navigate currently in the country, and some of the design issues, some of the issues around the economics and financing, and so on and so forth. I think the first thing to say is that the struggle for basic income is obviously a struggle for human rights and dignity. And, you know, given what's going on, we just felt it would be wrong not to mention the gross violation of human rights that the people of Gaza are experiencing now. These things are all ultimately interconnected. Just to say, Neil and colleagues, that this series that you're launching is very well timed. We think that the global focus on basic income now is really about how do we scale up and move to a new phase in the struggle for basic income, moving away from pilots to implementation at scale. And I know that's something that you're thinking about. And, you know, the fact that we first in the series, we think, you know, without being immodest, was a good choice, because South Africa is precisely moving into a phase of national implementation. And we've outlined the reasons for that in our blog and on autonomy, and I'll speak a bit more about that. Why we think South Africa could become a world leader on UBI. Firstly, not for the good reasons. The negative reasons are the level of distress in our society, hunger, poverty, and unemployment create massive urgency to introduce some form of basic income support. And we have a sort of perfect storm of factors that I'll go into just to explain why the political economy of South Africa lends itself to the urgent introduction of basic income. But at the same time, it might be that what people understand in the USA or in the UK or Spain or other countries about basic income might be very different from what we eventually achieve in South Africa. And the reason for that is firstly that we're talking about the springboard or the platform for basic income being a grant for adults, the social relief of distress grant that Kelly's going to talk about. But it's a national grant, and which means that South Africa has moved beyond the evidence gathering phase. We're now focusing on national scale intervention. Secondly, that there is widespread support for the introduction of basic income amongst a whole range of forces in society, including trade unions. And Neil was saying to us the other day that, you know, a number of unions are very skeptical of UBIG. And, you know, that is not the case in South Africa, where we have widespread support, both from civil society, trade unions, and the governing party. You know, thirdly, that we have extensive social assistance programs for children and the elderly in South Africa, but have historically had no social assistance, largely speaking, for working age adults, which means that the UBI, certainly initially in South Africa, will be aimed at those aged 18 to 59. We don't want to do away with the other grants, and we don't want to get into a situation where grants are rationalized and eventually the value, the total value that communities receive from those grants is actually reduced. And finally, the introduction of hyper-austerity in South Africa at the moment. There's a massive debate raging with Treasury arguing that we've run out of money, we're at a fiscal cliff, and so on and so on. And our institute, the IEJ, has produced an important analysis of the fiscal situation, pushing back very strongly at Treasury. And that's resulted in the last few weeks, also not just that, but battles within government and within the ruling party in a pushback to Treasury's agenda. But this is going to be an ongoing issue. And on the 1st of November, we have the medium-term budget policy statement, which is a 3-year budget, which will signal what sort of approach is going to be taken. I'll come back to this issue, but it relates to some real warning bells which have been rung around the danger of some form of basic income deducting or reducing the level of public services, or being financed by cuts in other areas, or being regressively financed, for example, through value-added tax. And Kelle will also talk about that. So you cannot separate the battle for basic income in South Africa, and I don't believe in any other country, from the battle for a developmental macroeconomic framework. The momentum towards a basic income in South Africa, as indicated, is commensurate with the depth of our crisis. Although South Africa is categorized as an upper middle income country, the reality that the majority face is very different from that categorization. Firstly, the crisis of hunger. Over a quarter of South Africans live below the food poverty line. And a shocking study found that 1 in 5 South African households are regularly sending a family member out to beg for food. Recently, there were some tragic incidents in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, where 2 mothers committed suicide together with actually, killing their children because of the level of hunger and desperation in society. So it's really significant and serious. The crisis of poverty, over half of South Africans live in poverty. The crisis of unemployment is that South Africa's level of unemployment is the highest in the world amongst peer economies, with over 42% or 11.9 million people unemployed, and nearly 80% of those are long-term unemployed. And we are known as the most unequal country in the world. So, as I say, it's a perfect negative storm in that regard. In relation to why it's been so difficult to turn the situation around, just very briefly, we inherited certain, structural features from apartheid and from our colonial era, which have mitigated against the African working class and poor establishing sustainable livelihoods, including the level of landlessness and the lack of a vibrant peasant economy. The small size of our informal economy is much smaller when compared to other developing societies in Africa and Latin America, for example. The financialization and deindustrialization of our economy, and also the spatial marginalization of rural and urban communities from the economic centers as a result of apartheid planning. But this has not only been inherited from the apartheid state, it's also been intensified, we argue, by a number of inappropriate macroeconomic policies which have reinforced some of these structural features, such as financialization, for example, and deindustrialization of the economy. And active labor market measures are not able to address these structural realities because they are so deeply ingrained. Secondly, people will have heard about the levels of corruption and running down. The hollowing out of the South African state is also not just a result of corruption, but also a result of the austerity policies that have been implemented over the last number of years. which have hollowed out our state-owned enterprises and our public services. Basic income offers an opportunity to short-circuit that crisis of state capacity. We've seen with the social relief of distress grant, within a couple of years, 11 million people were receiving that grant. And according to UN WIDER, over half of the South African population was benefiting from that grant directly or indirectly. So it's a very rapid form of income transfer. And thirdly, the stimulus impact, which Kelle will talk about, of the injection of income into poor and working class communities, could provide a platform for economic renewal and development. And this is also obviously backed up by the international evidence on the impact of basic income trials that so many of you have worked on. Internationally, we argue that the UBIC has particular relevance to the current international moment. Neil referred to the, if you like, the poly crisis, the multiple intersecting crises, including the deep economic scarring, the climate crisis, labor displacing technologies and AI, rising inequality and growing hunger. So while basic income is relevant everywhere there's economic distress, and that's certainly true in the global north, it's particularly relevant, we believe, in the global south, which is hit by economic precarity, and more so in countries like South Africa, which is riddled with these structural issues which I spoke about. So is the demand a radical one? We don't want to exaggerate the sort of revolutionary radical potential of a basic income grant. It is potentially radical. It has significant potential to push for a rethinking of how economies work, the issue of livelihoods, the role of carers, and work itself. But it needs to be combined with a number of other sort of economic policies which people are talking about, whether it's the 4-day week, whether it's new types of economic policies relating to monetary and fiscal policies, and so on and so forth. But despite this progressive potential, is controversial in certain progressive circles, including in South Africa, because of the fear that it will replace public services and may undermine workers. There's a very interesting paper which I encourage people to read, by Isabel Ortiz, who's an international expert on austerity, who was head of social protection at the International Labour Organization, who outlined 6 potential negatives that a basic income would need to avoid, namely being set at an inadequate level, coming at the expense of other social spending, being funded by regressive taxation, and not being accompanied by public provision of basic services, nor being supported by a broad social consensus, and the importance of transparent legal and institutional frameworks. Kelle and I, mainly Kelle, drafted a paper for the International Labour Organization which analyzed these factors and compared them to the South African proposals. And we'll come back to that. We've got a grid in our presentation which analyzes the extent to which the South African proposals comply with these sorts of conditions set out by Ortiz. But we do feel that it is potentially progressive for the working class. While it can be accommodated in a capitalist society, it's to a certain degree runs counter to the logic of capitalism, because income is not dependent on servicing capital. Areas like reproductive work, which are not seen as directly producing surplus value, are rewarded by society as part of the social dividend. So basic income is independent of economic cycles and financial markets, and therefore has an element of delinking. It can potentially reinforce the power of workers and boost the reservation wage, namely what workers are prepared to accept, because they have some independent access to income. It combats precarity, particularly if combined with union organization and labor protection, as well as a national minimum wage floor. We don't want to exaggerate this. In the South African context, any basic income is not likely to be above the poverty line, certainly not for a long time to come. But with the levels of unemployment and poverty in our society, you can imagine that if every adult had access to a basic income, together with, the national minimum wage, regulation to achieve decent work, etc., you massively improve the level of household income, because there is a pooling of income, particularly in extended families. So it does give workers greater opportunity to seek a better quality of employment, engage in skills upgrading, or own economic activities. And we've heard about the Great Resignation in the global north, where workers have been empowered to resist or leave extreme low-wage jobs because of the COVID cash transfers that were offered, particularly in the United States. It could also be a boost for progressive movement in this period of demoralization, could give greater hope and confidence to people that they can achieve material improvements, even in this period of deep crisis where there are growing attacks on working people. It also gives progressive movements an anchor in the face of these economic fluctuations. And there we were thinking, for example, of the Brazilian experience, the way the national minimum wage and Bolsa Familia secured the PT popularity in Brazil, even though they had a minority of seats in their Congress. But we shouldn't exclude the possibility that right-wing populists may move towards some form of basic income to shore up their support, as Bolsonaro attempted to do. There's also a growing movement in the global south for basic income, including in a number of countries in Africa and Latin America. And finally, we don't think that the debate between the UBIG and a jobs guarantee is really helpful. It creates a false polarity. In a country like South Africa, the presidential employment scheme and public works programs play an important role, but that's a very different role from that of basic income, both in terms of the number of people that it can reach, as well as some of the challenges that those schemes and programs have, as we've seen in India with the MNREGA program. But it's quite clear that in South Africa and elsewhere, the struggle for basic income will be fiercely resisted, both by capital and conservative bureaucracies, because it is pushing for a redistribution of resources, a radical redistribution of resources. And this is the reality that we've experienced in South Africa. So that as these forces push back, there's a real danger that the demand for basic income will be hollowed out and become tokenistic in its level, narrowly targeted and means tested, subtract from public services and linked to coercive workfare or employment conditionalities, and funded by regressive taxation such as VAT. And Kelle will talk a little bit more about some of these. So for these reasons, we argue that a UBIG in South Africa and elsewhere can only be achieved through a combination of a number of factors: the levels of social crisis, popular mobilization, political engagement with policymakers, and the advancement of coherent policy proposals and the marshalling of international evidence. We don't think one of these alone can succeed in achieving it. And we've seen that powerfully in South Africa, where no matter how good the proposals and analysis has been, only with social mobilization do we make headway. So in South Africa, just briefly, the situation is that there is significant support, but there's also political resistance. The SRD grant that we were speaking about is probably now politically irreversible. Our elections are coming in 2024, sometime between May and August. And the ANC and the president are championing an extension of the grant and its conversion into some form of basic income support. And we need to emphasize that. That is highly contested. Treasury and other forces have attempted, however, to terminate the grant. And they are particularly afraid that it'll become a permanent entitlement. We had a recent situation where Treasury issued a circular instructing all departments to cut spending across the board. And in a presentation to the president that was made a couple of months ago, they argued that this was because of the strain that the grant was putting on the fiscus, which was a clearly political intervention, because this grant that we're talking about costs less than 2% of the national budget. So they're not so worried about the cost of the grant. They're worried much more about its implications moving forward in terms of creating a permanent entitlement. So they've tried multiple ways to sabotage progress on basic income and advance other very limited grants to make a basic income unachievable. The ANC had been split on this issue, but in July last year, as well as in their December National Conference, they formally took resolutions announcing support for a UBIG and for a wealth tax to finance it, although there continues to be some debate around that. So we have a basic income for adults in South Africa since 2020, de facto. It's now a question of transforming it, making it permanent, and extending it to a far greater number of people, but also dealing with the exclusionary conditions, which Kelle will talk about. And therefore, any idea of introducing a pilot in South Africa is a non-starter, because it would take us backwards. We have a national platform for basic income. So last couple of slides is to say that the campaigns by civil society, including General Moyo's organization, Pay the Grants, the Black Sash, the trade unions, and a number of other civil society organizations have been very important in unifying and supporting this issue in South African society. And a coalition of organizations to which we belong, the IEJ and Pay the Grants and many others, has been campaigning and has mobilized grassroots support, engaged with policymakers with some degree of success. So the civil society campaign has succeeded, and the pressure from upcoming elections to retain this grant and to expand it is a key factor in the favor of a permanent basic income. Opposition has largely been confined to elements of business and elements in the state, as I've mentioned, particularly Treasury, but also some elements within the presidency. Some social forces, unfortunately, such as the churches, who've played a leading role in such campaigns, have tended to remain silent on this issue, but this issue is now being taken up to a greater extent. And one of the people on this webinar, Bukewa, is involved in mobilizing the churches around this campaign. I'm going to skip that slide. And, colleagues and comrades can read this in their own time. But in essence, basically following a meeting with the president in January last year, a whole series of pending meetings have been set up subsequent to that, but we've not yet met with the president again. We've met with leading officials in government and the presidency and the Department of Social Development. And then we trace there a number of important breakthroughs that have happened, including in the ANC and government, around those issues, including through a task team that was set up in government, including through a manifesto review that the ANC undertook, etc. I'm not going to go into that now. So finally, just before Kelle comes in, the contestation clearly is a very fierce one, and it's undecided. This mobilization in all those areas, including the court action, which Kelle will talk about, which is very important, has had significant impact, and the outcome will depend on the balance of forces in society. So we see the possibility of some sort of progressive outcome. The collapse of the commodities boom does make it more difficult, because revenue has now down, and that's being used to claim that we have now reached this fiscal cliff, et cetera, et cetera. But the social tensions, which we saw in July 2021, people may have heard, there was widespread looting in 2 areas of South Africa, which had important elements of food riots. There are many people in the country who believe that if these issues of poverty and hunger are not addressed, inter alia through the introduction of basic income, that there is going to be an explosion again in South Africa along the lines of July 2021. So having considered all this, there is the real possibility that South Africa could become a world leader on basic income, but there's also this massive pushback. And so whether we're a bright light in this terrain, time and struggle will tell. So just hand over to Kelle. I don't know, Kelle, if you want me to continue sharing, or whether you want to take over.
Whatever's easiest for you, Neil. If you'd like to take a break, I'm happy to take the reins.
Okay, it's fine. If you want to take over, that's
okay,
fine.
Cool. Then you'll just need to stop sharing. Okay, great. And I will. Okay. So Neil has outlined the broad strokes of the political moment and some of the contestation around a basic income grant. I will go into a little bit more of the policy detail and some of the technical areas of debate around designing and financing a basic income and how we get from what we have now, the SRD grant, to something that is more comprehensive and resembles the kind of international idea of a UBI. So just to give you a little bit of further background to the SRD grant, what it is and what it does. It currently provides 350 Rand per month to adults with little to no income. So that's about $18 or roughly $50 based on purchasing power parity. So it's very low and it's well below the food poverty line. It was introduced in April 2020 as an emergency COVID social protection measure, and it was intended to be temporary, but it has been extended and withdrawn and reinstated a number of times. The only time that it was withdrawn for a significant period was, not coincided, it was over the period in which we saw the July riots in 2021. It's now set to expire in March 2024. There's only budget allocation in the medium-term expenditure framework through March 2024. As Neil said, it's likely to be extended again given the political pressure to retain it. There have been a number of robust studies that have showed the significant positive impacts of the SRD grant, despite its small value. We know that more than 90% of grant recipients spend their SRD grant on food. It's commonly pooled within households, so it does make a greater contribution to household budgets. It also has had a significant poverty mitigating impact. So over the period of the COVID lockdown in 2020 and into 2021, it prevented about 2 to 2.8 million people from falling into food poverty and up to 3 million people from falling below the upper bound poverty line. Receipt of the SRD grant has also been shown to increase the likelihood of employment. So this is based on job seeking, supporting job seeking behavior, as well as supporting local economic activities. It's had a positive impact on both formal and informal businesses. And I think it's important to note for an international audience that it's one of the few surviving COVID era cash transfers globally. So there was this moment when in the early stages of the pandemic where many countries around the world introduced emergency social protection measures, and social protection advocates, as I'm sure many in the seminar are aware, kind of had this great moment of hope where we might see a new paradigm in social protection. Unfortunately, many of those, well, the vast majority of those measures have now been abandoned, but the SRD grant does provide a kind of glimmer of hope. And as Neil said, it opens up a real window of political possibility, providing a pathway towards a basic income grant. Much of this Neil has already gone over. There is fierce contestation around the SRD grant with increasingly limited fiscal space and an election coming up in 2024. I think, Neil, you've been over everything on this slide. So let me move on to say that whilst the SRD grant has had extremely significant positive impacts, including in providing a lifeline against hunger and starvation for many recipients, it has also been kind of riddled with administrative issues and injustices. So this largely stems from the fact that the grant has been consistently severely underfunded. The National Treasury has imposed a budget cap that is not sufficient to provide the grant to everybody who is eligible. In turn, this has forced the Department of Social Development to find ways to exclude and prevent people from accessing the grant, both in terms of changing the regulations, changing the eligibility criteria in the regulations, but also erecting procedural barriers to access. In 2022, they were so successful at excluding eligible beneficiaries from the grant that they underspent the budget, and this provided a further justification for Treasury to then cut the budget further. So while at its height, the grant was reaching 11.9 million beneficiaries, that's been slashed to about 8 million now. We estimate that roughly 16 million adults in the country, if not more, are living below the food poverty line. So that's about a 50% rate of exclusion error. And there are multiple drivers of this exclusion. So they include the fact that applications can only be made online and they can only be made in English. Given the digital divide in South Africa, about 20% of households don't have access to the internet. So this already excludes a large proportion of the most vulnerable. There's also an arbitrary means test for the grant, which is currently below the food poverty line. So the means test is 624 Rand per month, whereas the food poverty line has increased to 760 Rand per month. The way the means test and other eligibility criteria are verified is also highly exclusionary. Verification is based on checking applicants against what are known to be extremely out of date and inaccurate government databases to see whether they are employed as in taxpayer, income taxpayers, whether they are receiving unemployment insurance. And in addition, a new verification system has been added since last year, which consists of monthly checks on applicants' bank accounts. And this is a very blunt way of assessing income eligibility because it cannot distinguish between funds that constitute regular income and funds that are held on behalf of others, or one-off or ad hoc donations from friends and family to prevent the applicant from facing hunger and food insecurity. And then on top of all this, there is an appeals process that is largely useless in the sense that it doesn't allow people to submit any new or extenuating information or evidence on appeal. So if they've been found to be ineligible based on an inaccurate government database, there is absolutely no way for them to make the case on appeal that that actually isn't true. And we know that in the most recent months for which we have data, not a single appeal on the basis of having income above the means test was upheld. So that's about 1.2 to 1.5 million appeals per month. And you can see the impact of all of these exclusionary issues taken together. That this is the rate of applications in blue, approvals and payments for the grant. So a couple of things to note here. In April 2022, the grant was brought under new regulations with much stricter eligibility criteria, and all existing beneficiaries were cut off from the grant at very short notice and asked to reapply under a new application system and new criteria. So that's where you see that precipitous drop in numbers in April. In addition, Whilst applications have, begun to recover to their the level that they were before April, and a level that we know is quite kind of commensurate with the number of people living below the food poverty line, approvals have remained kind of artificially exactly below the budget cap that DSD has from Treasury. In addition, payments have not been keeping pace with approvals, and this is because of a number of technical and procedural issues with the payment systems and with the third parties contracted to administer these payment systems. So there are not insignificant number of people who have been approved for the grant but have not received payment. You can also see the erosion in the value of the grant here. So the grant value has remained static, whilst the food poverty line, which is calculated based on the real prices of a basket of basic food goods, has increased significantly, and most recently jumped quite significantly given our very high rates of food inflation. So the grant now represents 46% of the food poverty line, and its purchasing power has been severely eroded, as has the means test threshold. And this brings me to the litigation that has been launched by IEJ and Pay the Grants. In July, our litigation challenges all of these barriers to access that I've mentioned, and it also challenges the real terms erosion in the value of the grant and the means test threshold, which we argue represents a retrogression of the constitutional right to social assistance. So the Constitution has formed a basis for advocacy for expanded and comprehensive social protection in South Africa since 1994. The Constitution obligates the government to realise the right to social security for everyone, and social assistance for those who are unable to support themselves or their dependents. And this right is progressively realisable. And that's what we're really challenging in our case. So we're taking this constitutional provision and saying, actually, the government has gone backwards in terms of providing this right. And that's a breach of their obligation to progressively realise the right to social assistance. You'll see there highlighted in green that there is a qualifier within available resources. And this is where much of the contestation comes down to now. And it's really where the lines along which the court case will be kind of argued. Can we afford a basic income grant? What does within available resources mean? So opponents of the basic income grant argue that South Africa simply cannot afford it, that it would require increasing borrowing or raising taxes, both of which are not feasible options because they'll have negative impacts on investment, growth, and long-term fiscal sustainability. And it's true that we face multiple fiscal challenges, which Neil has been over, so I won't rehash them in detail, but we have stagnant growth, declining tax revenue, whilst our debt to GDP ratio is in line with peer countries. The cost of South Africa's debt is comparatively very expensive, and that's in large part the result of the lack of a credible growth strategy. And so austerity, really responds to and has also been at the root of these issues. The government's implemented an austerity framework for the past decade, and the country has ended up in what has been called a fiscal cul-de-sac, with very limited options as to where to from here. And in the face of the latest budget deficit, as Neil mentioned, the Treasury has embarked on a campaign of trying to force these indiscriminate cuts across all areas of government with the kind of rationale of the need to stabilize debt. But of course, with public services so severely compromised, these cuts would further undermine service delivery and growth. They would threaten to collapse the economy and precipitate social instability. And again, just in the last few weeks, Treasury has threatened to raise VAT if the SRD grant is continued. So they've threatened to raise VAT in order to fund the SRD grant after March 2024. Because VAT is a regressive tax that disproportionately burdens the poorest, this would of course undermine the poverty alleviation impact of the SRD grant and be ultimately self-defeating. But there's been a fierce pushback from civil society to these wholesale cuts. And it seems that they are for now off the table, although the situation changes very quickly. But we've, maintained that a progressive basic income grant is not possible if austerity conditions remain in place. If it displaces funding from basic services, it could do real harm. It could have detrimental impacts as opposed to beneficial impacts. I realize that we're short on time. I'll try to take you through these remaining slides as quickly as possible, although as you'll see, there's a fair bit of information here. So we're kind of fighting this battle against this narrative that basic income is an enormous cost with little macroeconomic benefits. What we are arguing is that it actually presents one of very few options that we have to turn around our macroeconomic situation, to catalyze growth, and particularly inclusive growth. So it's not just a large expense, it's a development policy. And I think many here are familiar with the international literature on the impacts of cash transfers and basic income, but we would expect that a comprehensive or more expansive basic income in South Africa would boost economic activity, and especially in depressed areas, by increasing aggregate demand in the economy, increasing consumption. It would enable people to invest in productive assets, to form enterprises. It would enable job seeking. We know job seeking is quite expensive in South Africa, and in fact, well above the amount, the food poverty line itself. So people need to choose between eating and looking for work. It would enable job creation. And as Neil said, it would increase the reservation wage and improve workers' collective bargaining power, as long as it's accompanied by strong labour protections. So it would have a multiplier effect in the economy, flowing back into government revenue such that the net cost of the basic income would be well below the gross cost. And it would have positive social impacts across a range of areas, including health, education, the partial compensation of care, as well as improve social cohesion and reduction in crime, which we also find in the international literature, and I think is highly relevant to South Africa's kind of crumbling social compact. So together, these impacts reduce the cost of poverty to the state and individuals, and can catalyze a virtuous macroeconomic cycle. And this is my last slide. So, this is the kind of contentious fiscal debates that are happening around basic income at the moment, but we're really trying to keep within view the fact that the design of the basic income is extremely important to the question of whether it is ultimately progressive and transformative. Despite these kind of sharp divisions within government, it is highly likely that we will see some form of basic income, of expanded basic income within the next couple of years. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how. And so we are really trying to bring these design considerations to the fore. And there are a number of areas of consensus in terms of design features amongst proposals for a progressive basic income that have emanated from civil society and government actors. It should build on the base of the SRD grant, maintaining and expanding the current beneficiary base. We should progressively realize the principle of universality, which we haven't talked about much in this lecture, but universality is the ultimate objective of many basic income proponents in South Africa, although we acknowledge that it may need to be phased in gradually to avoid a shock to the economy. It should be indexed to the national poverty lines, which are objective measures of need. in order to be adequate, and it should be increased as the poverty lines increase to account for increases in the cost of living. Should be provided to individuals, not the heads of households, and this is important to reduce particularly women's vulnerability to dependence on a male breadwinner, and by extension vulnerability to financial abuse and gender-based violence. It should be free of behavioural conditionalities, such as requirements for job seeking, for instance, alcohol and drug testing, and a number of other potential requirements that have been attached to cash transfers around the world. And this is because such conditionalities are costly and basically impossible to police, and can reduce beneficiaries' agency. They don't have, their policy impacts are not justified by their costs. It should be financed by non-regressive financing mechanisms, which we've been over. We need to address the issues of exclusion, the administrative barriers that the court case highlights, and we've put forward a number of suggestions for doing that, including in the what's it called, the relief that we're requesting in the court case. The child support grant should maintain parity with the basic income grant so that children and their caregivers don't get left behind. If otherwise, caregivers, predominantly women, will need to subsidise the costs of childcare from their basic income grant, which would exacerbate or reproduce gender inequity. And of course, existing public services must be maintained and improved. We can't have a basic income grant that displaces funding from existing public services, which are already severely compromised, and would simply transfer, would simply enable the private sector to capture the basic income as people need to seek these services in the private sector. I'm sorry, I think we've gone well over our time allocation. So I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you both very much. That was super interesting, super detailed. It's a very unique and inspiring set of circumstances, difficult though they are, and as you articulate. Before we go to questions, I would love to hear from General Moyo and Pay the Grants to add whatever you think is relevant, necessary, important, useful at this point, and to tell us about the wider work that you folks are doing. And then we'll open it up to some questions, of which I already have quite a lot. General Moyo, over to you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Very much so.
Okay. Since the two colleagues have covered most of what I was to cover, I think they did me a bit of a justice there in doing me that. But what I would like to cover is what we do or who we are as Pay the Grants. Yeah. Hashtag Pay the Grants is a non-profit organization with a core mission is the advancement of the comprehensive social protection through strengthening grassroots efforts in effective advocacy and activism. In recognition of the necessity of greater income support in South Africa, highlighted by COVID, and inadequate support by community voice within the fight for this, hashtag Pay the Grants was formed in 2020, initially within the COVID-19 People's Coalition under the Cash Transfer Group. The campaign is about holding the state accountable for its failure to implement the COVID Social Relief of Distress Grant, known as 350 Grant. We are building a record of people's experiences trying to assess the grant and raising awareness to mobilize for a universal basic income guarantee for all. The COVID grant is a gateway to a universal basic income grant because it is the first time in South Africa that unemployed people aged from 18 to 59 have been introduced or included in the social grant system and so later evolving into an independent campaigning platform. So that's who we are as Pay the Grants campaign. And then what I'll cover or emphasize is why part. Why are we advocating for this grant in South Africa? As many of you might know, that South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world and has become more unequal over time. The richest 10% took half of the income by 1994 and the 2/3 today. That's what we are seeing and observing through the corruption, through the patronage, through the tender system and all of that. Collective wealth should be redistributed to allow for a more dignified living for all. A UBIG will improve health, education, child nutrition, and help people look for work. A universal basic income guarantee is a commitment by government to ensure that everyone has a minimum level of income to meet their basic needs. This is done through a regular cash transfer or a grant that spurs development and promotes sustainable livelihoods. But the benefits of a UBIG are not just economic. A UBIG can benefit society by improving health and education outcomes, increasing social cohesion, and supporting gender equality. That's the role that we play, and that's how we see this as what it can do to communities and in terms of how it can be utilized. And then the role that UBIG can play in development. There has been debates about introducing the BIG since 1990s in South Africa. It's not a new debate. A BIG can have transformative effect in South Africa, helping to shift structural poverty, alleviate some of the impact of deeply entrenched unemployment, and end hunger in the country. Rather than being a drain on the economy, a UBIG can contribute to growth and more people spend money in their local communities and have the means to better their economic position. Then we have the crisis as inherent feature of our economic system, which is something that is a bit disturbing. Ecological health and geopolitical and economic crises are all increasing in frequency and severity, and we have accepted that for the time being. Crisis is an inherent feature of our economic system. We urgently need to mitigate against unfolding crises, including through a just transition to a low carbon economic, improved pandemic preparedness, and many other measures. However, we also need to build reliance to inevitably future crises by providing a social safety net, which limits the impact of shock on the most vulnerable. The COVID-19 crisis demonstrated the way in which shocks exacerbated economic exclusion and vulnerability of those importance of policies which ensure basic needs are met in times of emergency, both to protect the rights of individuals as well as the wider economy. In addition, we anticipate future labor market disruptions as a result of the climate emergency and the transition to a low carbon economy, as well as the acceleration of labor, saving automation or technology designed to replace or fragment existing jobs. This underscores the fact that while wage work will remain important for productivity and purpose, it cannot be a sole determination of dignity. We accept the inevitability of further and deeper socio-economic shock arising from the inherent instability of the global economic system. Thus, a permanent social protection floor is crucial in shielding people from the West effect of severe climate breakdown, inflation and the rising cost of living, future public health crisis, technologies disruption, floods, insecurity, and increased labor precarity. A permanent social protection floor mechanism pragmatically ensures the basic right to a survival and a UBIG for all aged 18 to 59. It's a most appropriate method of establishing a floor in South Africa. Then from our experiences and lessons that we learn through the push that we've been pushing for this, as Comrade Neil have alluded to the key political moments, we have seen some pushback of which we've been pushing as the campaign through many efforts like the protest, trying to engage with the state, and many other efforts that we've tried the avenue, as Comrade Kelle also explained, partly about the litigation that we are in partnership with the IEJ, trying to take the state and especially the DSD and the SASA to court for that particular failures in terms of their system and the glitches within the system, which are structural exclusion in terms of excluding majority of the people who are supposed to be in the system. So for us, we've seen all of those pushbacks from the side of the state in terms of trying to engage with the state and trying to reason with the state. And even though there are substantiative research that has been done by private institutions like your IEJ and the others that are backing up our evidence and our support, our call, those pushbacks have been through the National Treasury, which have given some instructions to the departments to make sure that they impose those austerity measures and cut some other crucial services which are going to hit back on the poor and the marginalized poor communities, like the cuts on education, the cuts on healthcare. Those are the very same things that are going to cause other unrest in the country for those services if they are to be terminated or to be cut through these austerity measures. So those are the obstacles that we are currently still facing, but we hope that the mobilization and the building of the networks and the strengthening of our campaign will be a key to push beyond those unjust prohibitions of those relevant researches and evidence that we are trying to produce. So for now, the hope for us is the litigation process to try and convince the state through the state mechanism, which is the court case. We know the court case might drag for long, but our hope lies there, not only with the court, with our efforts in terms of mobilizing, agitating the community, and making sure that this does not become other political games, as we know that next year we are going for the national elections. And there's that contestation that also Comrade Neil covered broadly in terms of how this contestation will affect this push. So we are looking to the majority of those that are excluded, who are the potential voters, to make sure that they rally behind the campaign and they make sure that they understand this effort that we're trying to make, so that they cannot be used, or this UBIG cannot be used as another political scoring goals for the electioneering next year. So those are the key positions and the key role that we are also playing as the campaign and the movement, and making sure that we take the community in confidence, we build a society with the understanding, and we build that consciousness, even with other partners like your unions, the labor forces, other civil society, and other institutions, which are the friends to the campaign. So that's how actually we've been building as the campaign. So we're glad to hear that this webinar of today is called by our name, which is Pay the Grants in South Africa. So we are that movement, Pay the Grant, that is pushing for this grant and the realization, the progressive realization of the universal basic income grant, because our end goal is to make sure that we reach that destination of the universality because the state have been pushing us to other directions, which we've been rejecting, like the so-called family grants, the so-called job-seeking grants, which we are totally objecting to those grants. But our end goal is it cannot be deviated. We cannot actually compromise on that. It's a universality in terms of the universal basic income granting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Inspiring and clear. I want to, before opening this to everybody for questions, and I'm seeing happy hands of applause from some of the folks here. I want to ask all three of you, from a non-South African perspective, hearing what you describe about the movement that you folks have built and the coalitions that you have, it seems much broader and more intersectional than in places like here. You mentioned the unions, for example, just as one set of stakeholders, which in much of the world, as we've discussed before, Kelle and Neil, are not on board and are often quite reticent. And you mentioned different social movements that have come inside the Pay the Grants coalition. Like, can you share a few thoughts, speculations about what is it about the South African context, about the organizing work that you folks have done that has enabled you to build a coalition that is manifestly broader than those we see for UBI in other places? Happy to hear from any or all of you. General, please.
Yeah, actually, our call has been a long call. It's not starting now. As I said, these negotiations and debate have started around the 90s.
Right.
So as the unemployed during those years, we've been calling for the social assistance, but the state around 1992, if I'm not mistaken, they've tried to introduce this or to discuss this, but in a way that it favors some of the state bureaucracy, in a way that they were actually modeling it. So it was around the job-seeking grant, which by that time they were talking about giving individual 150 for hunting a job, of which that was a method which was unrealistic, by the way, that there is no way that 150 can actually afford someone to go for job hunting for a month. Right. And in that, there was this means testing that was to be introduced with that you have to prove in a certain way, where did you went to in terms of looking for a job? How much is your travel, your transport cost, and so forth, which was unrealistic. Up to the end, where they were now lately discussing this so-called the family grants, which we also rejected. So with all of those rejecting, we're actually able to convince the so-called claimants or beneficiaries of those grants that this is what we think can work in a South African context, not this other way or other approach that they are trying to bring, which are the top-down approach, not actually informed by the realities on the ground.
Okay, thank you. Kelle, Neil, you want to add anything to that response before we throw it open to questions?
Yeah, maybe just to say, I mean, there are political traditions in South Africa, which are of, the mass democratic movement in South Africa, particularly in the 1980s, with the United Democratic Front, the trade unions and community organizations, youth organizations, etc. So those traditions continue. The movements are considerably weakened compared to what they were, but that tradition of what you call intersectionality remains. There have been some disappointments, like I mentioned. We're disappointed that the churches haven't taken it up. And they still remain, maybe Bukele could say something about that. They remain quite muted on the issue. But it was the trade unions who at first tabled this demand, as General Moyo said, in 1998 at the Job Summit. So it came from us. I was in those negotiations, and I can tell you, when we tabled this proposal, there were a lot of confused looks. What is this idea of basic income? Where does it come from? And so there's had to be a lot of education, discussion, contestation that's taken place. In the early 2000s, there was much more support, and then that died. And then in the COVID period, I think it just emerged again as quite a powerful thing.
Thank you. Let me open it up to others. Folks, please, I'm seeing James has chucked a question in, or two questions in there. I'm tracking those, James, in the chat, and I want to see if people have got their hands up. Yeah, so I see, Bukelo, you've got your hand up, and Reinhard, you've got your hand up. So let me come to you first, Bukelo, then let me go to Reinhard, and then we'll come to James's two in the chat. Please.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, everybody. I just wanted to respond about the intersectionality of this advocacy campaign. I'm from the church's side, and we have discovered that during the apartheid years, the church has been on the forefront of the demise of apartheid, if we were to put it in inverted commas. And now, during this poverty time and the time of hunger and inequality and unemployment, the church is silent. And so we've done an analysis and found out that, we cannot be the church alone dealing with the issue of a universal basic income grant, but we should join other stakeholders. And therefore, from our side, advocate for the church to be part of this coalition. And as a result, we have raised this in a big meeting that they had last weekend so that the church can be involved. And the SACC has agreed to be part of this advocacy.
Oh, we've lost you at a critical moment. That sounds like superb news. I'm seeing smiles on your faces. We lost you briefly, Bukelo. Could you say the last bit again? Oh no.
Government will only move if we form part with other civil society organizations to motivate or to advocate for the basic income grant. Hence, we as the church have joined the stakeholders and the basic income coalition. So I just wanted to say we are also now starting to be part of that, and we are looking forward to working with the other stakeholders. Thanks.
Thank you. That's excellent to hear, and I have no doubt that our three speakers will be thrilled to hear that if they hadn't already. Reinhard, let's go to your question.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank you for your very interesting and excellent presentations. I think that was very helpful and informative. I actually have three questions, so I'll keep it very short. I mean, question one is this idea that VAT is regressive. I mean, I'm a public health professional, so I'm not a tax specialist, but I read various articles. So if you have VAT and distribute it equally, then it becomes progressive. And I mean, for me, it's the same with a carbon tax. Because at the upper income end, you have high consumers. And in my opinion, you can also make VAT even more progressive, because in some countries, I don't know about South Africa, you have a zero tax on essential goods and a high tax on other goods. You could even have a luxury VAT tax. So it could be easily made into a progressive tax. So that's my first question and comment. Second one is, how far do you trust the South African state running a basic income trust, even if it's a basic income grant? I mean, I'm much more in favor of a basic income trust. And living in the UK, but being German, I have seen how the NHS can be dismantled easily by a government if it is in power. In Germany, we have a social insurance scheme, which is much more difficult for the government to interfere with. So I'm much more in favor of a trust rather than giving even more power to the state. And I mean, your administrative barriers have already highlighted some of the problems you get when you give a government too much power. And the third one is the idea of additional new taxes, or I prefer to call them fees, because I don't want to give it to the government. Having worked in Zimbabwe and visited South Africa, for instance, the land value fee or land value tax, which I think, and you cannot run away with your land. So it could be, in my opinion, relatively easy to raise new funds through such a sort of fee. So these are my three questions. Sorry for being so long. Thank you. And thank you again for your interesting presentations.
Thank you very much. I'm going to throw those straight open to anyone who wants to respond. Over to you, folks.
I can take, Neil, maybe I could take the tax questions and the question on trust in the state. Perhaps I would leave to you.
Perfect,
I actually realized after I finished speaking that I skipped a slide. So I had a slide on tax financing options that speak to some of your questions, Reinhard. But just on the question of whether VAT can be progressive, actually, the IEJ has put forward a number of possible financing mechanisms, 18 possible financing mechanisms that could be used to fund a basic income. And one of them is a luxury VAT. So yes, we have considered this issue, the possibility of a VAT on luxury goods, and it's among the suite of financing measures that we propose. And a flat increase to VAT as it stands would be regressive, including in the sense that the lowest deciles spend a disproportionately greater proportion of their income compared to the higher deciles, who are more likely to save or invest their money. So VAT, the kind of the conventional form of VAT as we have it now is regressive, but we would like the state to consider the possibility of a luxury VAT as one of a number of progressive financing mechanisms. And then on the question of additional new taxes, as I said, we've proposed a number. A land value tax isn't amongst them in the brief that we put out. Although personally, I do. I like the idea of a land value tax in the sense that it can't. It's difficult to hide your land as an asset, and it's difficult to move that asset offshore. But a number of the other taxes that we've proposed are a financial transactions tax, a commodity windfall tax, a social security tax, and of course a wealth tax. And we think there's a strong moral argument in South Africa, given the fact that much of the wealth was gained by apartheid era dispossession, for a wealth tax. But what we've said is that there are a number of potential additional progressive taxation measures, and we should carefully explore the options and the mix that would be feasible and desirable.
Thank you. Neil, you were going to add, and thank you for adding in the link there to that fact sheet.
Yeah. So I put a link in the chat, which just summarizes these 18 financing options that Kelly was talking about, just to indicate they're not supposed to be exhaustive. They're options, and the idea was to identify the ones that are most strategic to introduce in the short term, and then over the medium term. For example, the wealth tax is not something that you can introduce within a year or so. It takes it's a more medium term type tax. So nothing is excluded in principle. Everything's on the table. But obviously our Treasury is only interested in taxes which don't make the tax system more progressive. And so, that's why we are coming out against regressive taxes. There was an expert panel that reported, a number of months ago, which was appointed by a government department, the DSD, which also came out against regressive forms of taxation. The ANC itself, as we indicated, has come out in favor of a wealth tax. So this debate is quite live in society. On the question of, and also, Kelly, we need to answer the question in the chat from James. Maybe you could take the one on digital access. I'll come back to the question of trust in the state, but on James's first question, the differences between richer and poorer provinces, I think that General Moyo can also comment on this, that both the need and the access to the grant is quite widespread in different provinces in South Africa, both rural and urban. And in fact, in the run-up to the ANC conference, we engaged with different provinces of the ANC, including the Gauteng province, which is the industrial heartland of South Africa. And there's very extensive support for the grant in both the urban and the rural areas. There are issues that people in the rural areas confront in terms of accessibility, and Kelly can also talk about that when she talks about the question of digital access. I think I would not talk about a trust to administer basic income. I think, this is something that we want to be we want it to be legislated, we want it to be part of the state's commitment, which is connected to the Constitution and cannot be reversed. So the question of potential abuse of the scheme, I think, is actually one of the issues that's most in favor of basic income, because it's a direct transfer into people's pockets. And that's one of the reasons that we support universality, because it simplifies administration and it removes the power of bureaucrats to determine who qualifies for the grant and who doesn't. But as Kelly said, this is something that's going to be a progressive, gradual battle that we are going to have to push for more and more people to qualify until we eventually reach universality. We're not dogmatic on the question of universality. We support universality, but if it has to be between a generous basic income that goes to most of the poor versus something that is not going to be achieved in terms of universality, we'll certainly go for the former option. I think, once something like this has been achieved, there's no government that'll be able to reverse it. It's going to be so massively popular. I just take the national minimum wage in the UK. When it was introduced, the Conservative Party was quite resistant to it, and now it's become the most popular post-World War II policy in the UK, and the Conservative Party claims to be the major proponents of the national minimum wage. So I think there are ways of managing these things. Kelly, I don't know if you want to, and also General Moyer, just come in on the question of the digital access and other access, as well as the rich and poor, rural and urban issue.
Sure, thanks. I just wanted to say on universality that on paper, universality is the position of both DSD and the ANC. So, it's not necessarily a fringe thing. There is support for the principle of universality, but of course it is something that we don't expect to see soon. Thank you for the question on financial exclusion and access to digital financial services. This has played a big role, and you might remember the slide where I showed that payments have been lagging behind applications. This is the major reason for that, because the payment systems have been contracted out to various third-party providers, and also because of the system of bank verification. So I mentioned that applicants' eligibility is verified by monthly checks on their bank account. What this has meant is effectively people need to enter into formal banking in order to be able to access the grant. So it has increased kind of participation in formal banking, but it's also worsened dimensions of financial exclusion for those unable to or unwilling to participate in the formal banking system. And it's also increased the influence of private providers over these services. So people are now paying bank fees in order simply to be able to apply for the grant. So that erodes the value of the grant. And also if they are rejected, the application is rejected, then they're out of pocket. And that's not an insignificant expense for people living below the food poverty line. There's a really brilliant paper by Erin Torkelson called Collateral Damage, which I would encourage you to seek out, which tells the story of the influence of a third-party payment provider over a grant in South Africa, and the access of that provider to beneficiaries' data, which they use to engage in predatory lending practices. using the grants as collateral. So there is this danger of the use of third-party financial service providers in terms of exacerbating financial and digital exclusion, as well as introducing other potential negative impacts.
Thank you kindly. Just want to check, General, do you want to add anything into this response before we come to Cleo for her question? I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I'll let us drag over for a little bit so we have this last question answered.
Yeah, I think the issue that need to be emphasized and understood is the value, the current value of the 350, which doesn't meet anyone's needs. So I think that's a problematic issue that we are facing. And the accessibility of this grant, whereby you find that those in the far rural areas have to spend around or close to 100 Rand just for accessing it. And when the state systems fail, or the third party, like now we know that in South Africa, this grant is distributed through the banking system. So if there are those so-called technical glitches, you find that the recipient or the claimant is the one who suffers in terms of getting into unnecessary debt for borrowing money to go and access the grant itself. And when you finally receive the grants, you find that you are left with only 50 Rand. And you are supposed to survive for the whole month with that little 350 Rand, which does not even meet the essential needs of the human being. So I think on the question of VAT, currently there is no items that are being classified as essential, which are affordable to the poor. That's the other dilemma that we are also facing and dealing with, because we are charged the same prices in terms of the VAT or value-added tax as the rich. So the rich are paying the same 14% of value-added tax as the same as the poor, even on the essential goods. So when the state maybe discover such fluctuations of prices in those items, what they normally do, like they did in a couple of years back, is to establish a commission of inquiry. And the commission of inquiry won't be benefiting the beneficiaries or the people who lost during those purchases. Like last, there was a commission around the bread that was looking at the pricing of bread. And those bread companies were fined billions of rands, but we never knew what happened to the commission and how that money was rolled back to the very same poor that were ripped off during that high cost of bread. But currently, as we are speaking, the very same bread that we're complaining about a couple of years back is high now and is not living up to the expectations of the poor as the essential product. So those are the things that are making it difficult and are proving to be that this grant, the value of this grant is not sufficient enough currently in the form of 350 Rand, because that's absolutely up to nothing. But there are some roads that at least there is some light in those that are living in the dark, like in the poor of the poorest communities, that at least there is something, there is some hope. But eventually, when we reach to that point of universal basic income grant, I think that's where at least the gap that is widening of inequality and the high skyrocketing unemployment will be at least some kind of a way and a mechanism of trying to close some of those gaps. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I was just about to say that is a powerful and top-thumping note to end on, but I see that Neil has put his hand up, and possibly that will be to respond to Cleo's question. But Neil, go on, over to you.
Not so much to Cleo's question, but more to add to what General Moyo is saying, which is that this battle around the value is a very important one, but that it looks like we're making real ground on this point. When we distribute the presentation, in the appendix to the presentation, you'll see there's slides from both the presidency task team as well as the Department of Social Development, which both agree that the grant must be increased to at least the food poverty line. So this campaign by civil society around the value and so on is making some ground. The question is how the contestation with Treasury is going to pan out around this particular issue.
Yep, that makes sense. Let us wrap this up then with brief responses to what has rightly been identified as a very important question by Cleo. It links to the first question in many respects. How difficult has it been to get civil society institutions to adopt basic income as their cause, or at least one of their causes? And in a case where it has been more difficult, what was it that convinced them? I will add a preface to this. Cleo is a friend and comrade. We work together a lot here in the UK UBI space, and it's often quite hard work to convince even very closely allied institutions or individuals. And it seems, as we said at the top, very different in the case of South Africa. You've rightly identified the political economic history, the struggles against apartheid is important backdrops for understanding this, but could you give any brief insights to the specificities in terms of how difficult it's been to bring allies on board and what it has been that has shifted to bring them on board?
Kelly, do you want to have a shot?
I mean, Neil has been involved in this campaign for longer than I have, but I think one thought that comes to mind is that basic income is a very kind of simple and like cross-cutting demand. You know, I think that we work with a range of civil society organizations within this broader coalition called the Universal Basic Income Coalition, who work in very kind of different spaces. You know, the trade unions, the Women on Farms project, youth organizations. I think one thing that has helped bring people together and organize is just the simplicity of the demand. But of course, you know, it's a simple demand in the UK too, and you're facing greater barriers. So I think, you know, the depth of the crisis in South Africa is another factor. I think as Neil said, there's a broad kind of consensus that the interests of the working class are reasonably well aligned with the interests of the unemployed and the economically excluded. So I guess there's less of a kind of sense of competing interests, although the opponents of basic income are you know, definitely trying to divide and conquer and wedge different constituencies.
Of course.
Maybe I can just say quickly, Neil, is that I think the differences are more tactical rather than strategic, to use, you know, a phrase. The differences have been in terms of emphasis. You know, what value do you pitch it at? Should it be universal or should it be targeted to the unemployed? We had quite a big difficulty persuading the organizations of the unemployed that universality was a better way to go than targeting the unemployed, because they felt, well, you know, aren't you giving it to more wealthy people now? Aren't you diluting what we're going to get, et cetera, et cetera? So this is all about, you know, education, organization, compromise. And I think in the end, as I say, these have been issues of emphasis and tactics. Broadly speaking, we're all singing off the same hymn sheet.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. General, would you like to add a final word in response to this?
Yeah, I think now we are gaining momentum in terms of mobilizing, since we have now like agreements or consensus with the most federations or trade union federations that are joining the UBIG coalition, that are also advocating for the same positions that we've been advocating for. I think now at least we are gaining a ground. But previously, even the so-called beneficiaries or claimants were not actually believing this, in the understanding that this is something like a privilege from the state. It's not something that has been taken as a right or a constitutionalized guaranteed right. So now, with the mobilization, with the consciousness building through this communities, it's where the people start to realize that this is something that is fundamental for us to understand and to join also. So that's how we are also gaining that momentum in terms of building our network with other allies, and also progressive formations like your IEJ, which can substantiate the research and substantiate our position in that regard. So at least for now, there is that kind of an understanding with political parties and other formations in terms of fight for this right.
That makes sense. Thank you very much. And that is, again, a solid note to end on. I want to thank all three of you very, very much indeed. It couldn't have been more appropriate, I think, kicking this series off with you folks. It's very clear that we need to get you back either towards or just after the election next year to find out and to be able to share insights from what on earth happened and hopefully what led to and consolidated your success. But for now, genuine thanks to all of you and to everybody who has come. If you have questions, get in touch with me, get in touch with these folks. You have the reports in the chat, and obviously you can find everybody online. And I'll look forward to seeing lots of you, hopefully all of you, next month. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yes.
Cheers, peeps, and good luck.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.